math for medical technology. These were a little bit revolutionary for their time, and I would say they were a success. Karen's going to tell us something about how mathematics plays a role in medical technology that her institute has worked on and our old institute in active way. And also, there's some indication that math may still be useful in the future for medical, which is of interest, I think, to all of us.
Coming from the government and from a funding agency, I think I could summarize my role in one phrase: I'm the money. Which is good and bad, especially my role is a senior advisor to the director of one of the 27 institutes and centers that comprise NIH. I'll talk to you a little bit about NIH, do a little cover on that in case you don't know. NIVIB is the institute that I work for. That's the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. We are the technology-driven institute at NIH. Most of the institutes are disease or organ focused. So we are kind of the odd guys in a lot of ways. And we came to be largely because of needs within the engineering community and the radiology community for a voice and a home for their technology development and medical applications at NIH. It was very difficult for them to get funding for things that the rest of NIH didn't see as necessarily directly medically applicable. So we are the home for technology development, so a natural fit, I think, for some applications of mathematics. We're the youngest institute. We got started in the early part of this decade, and we now, because we're the 27th institute, and we can only have 27 institutes at NIH, there's pressure. We can't add any more. What are we going to do? So we're small, we're young, but we're more innovative, I think, in a lot of ways, and a lot more open to new challenges and new applications. So what we really want to do is accelerate the application of those technologies to biomedical problems. We are that intersection between life sciences and all the biologists and all the clinicians and physics, engineering, and math. This is a rough kind of overview of all the range of things that we support. They tend to fall into two categories, one more imaging related and one more engineering related. I have two highlighted because I'm going to be giving you an example from the biosensors and from MRI in my talk today. But you can see that what we cover is wide-ranging, from biomaterials to other technology development, engineering. Tissue engineering is a big focus of ours, and other up-and-coming imaging techniques such as ultrasound, and some of the ones that have been around a while, like CT. I threw in this old chestnut of Gary Larson's because it summarizes best, I think, the kind of things that we face in trying to form this intersection between biomedical applications and the technology drivers. And they really do speak in very different languages. It's a big problem for us, one that we, because we're the Technology Institute, see, I think, more than the rest of NIH does. And this actually goes both ways, although I'm much more inclined to think that the one who hears blah, blah, blah is the biologist rather than the other way around. And the reason I say that is because what you see isn't what you get. And just showing this symbol, I think, would cause most cell biologists' eyes to roll back in their heads. And if you try to talk about Gaussian functions or Fourier transforms, I really think that you would lose any kind of hope of interest in a lot of the biomedical community. But the reality is that biomedicine is technology-driven. And so we have to respect that and embrace it. That's what we're trying to do. So the first example I'm going to give you today is MRI. This particular image represents kind of a new frontier, actually. This is the An image of the human brain taken at 9.4 Tesla, which is, for anybody who does spectroscopy, about a little over 400 megahertz resonance frequency in protons. This was a proton-based image, and we see structures and detail in this image that were, before this, really not seen before. This is a lovely, gorgeous way to image parts of the body that non-invasively we couldn't do before. So while that is beautiful, it comes with a lot of physics barriers that we hope to overcome. This is not something that you can do every day. So what are some of the problems in MRI clinically? We need better images, and one of the drivers in MR is, okay, we will increase the field strength of the magnet. That increases signal to noise, so we get a much better image, except that there are barriers that we rapidly encounter, and we need to be able to overcome them. We need finer detail, like the image I showed you of the brain, which is really extraordinary. So we need spatial resolution improvement, and we need temporal resolution improvement. I'm going to be focusing more on the temporal resolution issues today, because anybody who has been in an MRI, say you had a thoracic or a brain MRI, and you're in this enclosed, really noisy hole for 30 minutes or more at a time, it's not the most comfortable experience. If you have any hint of claustrophobia, yeah, I don't like it. I think they're awful. So in order to image things better in shorter periods of time, we're looking for ways to accelerate this process. So I mentioned higher field MRI and just increasing the field strength so you get better signal to noise, so you get more fine detail in your images. The way we normally do imaging presents its own limits on the speed that we can acquire data and process the data. At higher field strengths, radio frequency homogeneity becomes a huge problem. You apply an RF field, it has its own homogeneity problems. You have RF coils to detect. They have homogeneity problems. And you have your own magnet Bohr problems as well. The higher the field strength, the more important this becomes, the more difficult it is to maintain homogeneity, if you can even get homogeneity. One of the outcroppings of this is you get distortion in image. You get blurring of images because of these differences. And one of the things that MR does is it provides contrast in different types of tissue. In the brain, it will give contrast between white matter and gray matter. In the abdomen, because of distribution of water and because distribution of fat, different tissues light up more or less, and that's how you get the detail. But when field strength changes, relaxation times for the protons in the tissues change, and that impacts the ability to obtain those contrasts. There's one of our grantees at NIH, Dan Sodikson, runs a wonderful Center for Biomedical Imaging at NYU. And I'm going to show you something that he's doing that's sort of near the forefront of making this process faster and better. Okay, so here is standard MRI. There's the magnet, and there's the lovely tray that sends you into that little hole. But what it really is more like is fax machine, because of the way the data are processed. It's a sequential device. You get a line of data obtained at a time. And so you were limited in many ways, not just temporally, by processing data in that way. So wouldn't it be better to make it a parallel process, like a digital camera, where you're looking at a wider field and getting several bits of information at a time in one image? And that's the kind of goal behind what it does. This is how it looks in terms of the data that you acquire in MR. If you have your RF coil, you're going to get one little bit of data at a time. You would move it, you get another bit of data at a time. Whereas in parallel imaging, you're doing several coils at once. You're getting all of that spatial data from those coils at once. call warp speed, because we're not limited to that line by line sequential bit of data manipulation. So parallel MRI actually does exist out in the world of clinical applications and has been around for a while, but in a kind of a rather primitive way. What it does is it uses spatial variation in the RF detector coils. I have coil there, but it's really multiples of coils to encode the spatial information. And because we have multiple coils and they may overlap with each other, that allows undersampling of the data, which means that we can go even faster. So we also reduce the number of gradient steps. That shortens the overall length of the exam. And then it also allows us to reconstruct some of those missing data because we know something about the coils themselves, their structures, and their own individual sensitivity profiles. This summarizes kind of what I've been saying. He points out that the use of parallel MRI is high and rising, especially as MRI is applied to different organ-to-organ systems or different types of imaging, such as angiography or cardiac imaging or brain imaging. And each of those organ systems has different needs and sets different requirements of the system. So we're trying to be adaptive to all those needs. What he points out here, and this is what I'm going to be talking about primarily, he talks about mini receiver systems, which means you've got receiver RF coils, and he has arrays of those. I'll show you some examples of those. But that's half of the problem. There is an RF acquisition side, and then there's an RF processing side that use coils. And so there are two ends of this whole process that we can exploit. I'll give you a comparison to something you may have seen or had done to you. This is multi-detector row CT, which is how most CT scans are done now. Here's your X-ray emitter source. And what happens is, as it goes through the tissues of the body, you have a series of detectors on the other side so that you're really getting multiple slices at once from that single beam. The corresponding thing in parallel MRI is a series of coils so that you get multiple data slices at one time. But both have parallel and sequential elements to them. The CT still requires a gantry to move the emitter from one position to another so that you get a 360-degree picture so that you can create slices through your subject. The parallel part is that you have multiple detector rows on the other end. In parallel MRI, you start with the parallel part where you have a series of coils so that you can image your subject. And then you step through gradients where you're changing the RF field that you apply gradually as you work through the process. What this allows is for us to do this less. So we have less data going into K-space, less to manipulate later. Here's my token bit of math. The signal that the coil sees is going to be related to both the sensitivity of the coil itself, and each coil is going to have its own sensitivity profile. So those things have to be teased out. You have to learn about those coils, and there are different ways you can do this. You can do phantom experiments so that you have kind of a baseline for comparison. It also depends a lot on the spin density of the object you're looking at. Protons in proton MR are going to be located in greater density in certain tissues than another, and it's exploiting that discrepancy that gives us so much of the power and quality of the images. So we have an unfolding and a refolding as we reconstruct the signal. This is where a lot of the difficulty is finding a suitable pseudo-inverse of the signal encoding matrix. Now, on the data acquisition end, there are a number of algorithms that have been developed, some in wider use than others. Sense and Grappa, I think, have been around the longest and have what these all do is exploit different properties to regularize parallel imaging. You can also vary your acquisition as a function of time. Here are a couple of examples of algorithms that do that. And then there are combinations of spatial and temporal techniques, such as using, say, another algorithm unfold to combine the two properties. These all have different uses. I'll talk about some of these later. These, in particular, are good post-processing uses. And here's the physics of the whole thing. So the idea behind parallel imaging is you've got multiple coils giving you multiple bits of signal at the same time in one big rush. The more coils you get, the faster you get to go. So you think, okay, wow, let's have 1,000 coils. We can have 2 acquisitions and we're done. And we're out of the instrument and we don't have to sit in that horrible thing for all that period of time. But here's where physics rears its ugly head. The more coils you have, the more heating they actually generate. And so then you've got a problem called the specific absorption rate of RF energy into the tissues. And you can actually cook tissues if you get too much juice going through the coils and too many of those coils at the same time. And you can imagine that, say, on your head, you really want 100 coils blasting around and overheating your cranium. So that's a problem. Just the sheer engineering of all these coils and getting them to operate reliably and repeatably is difficult. These are some examples of things that they've done in New York. And this is called a bird cage. I won't go into more detail on that, but this would be for lung or some abdominal imaging, for example. So different constructions can be used for different body parts, and it's all part of a specialization process. Here's the representation of the bird cage I showed you before. This was actually used to get the highest quality, fastest image of lungs that we know to date. But that took 128 element detector arrays. That's a lot to cope with on a number of scales. But one of the things you can get out of this is you can learn a lot about coronary function. This is an image reconstruction of lungs and brachial tree. This one I wish I had animated because this is something that is really really new and hot. These are nerve fibers in the brain, and it turns out last summer the first complete reconstruction of the cerebral cortex was completed using network theory and following these bundles all throughout the brain. Never seen before, and learning something about how the brain functions on an entirely different scale, entirely different way than we have been able to do before. So they're just starting to tease out some of the amazing power of MR in these different organ systems. This is actually a fetus. Motion is a problem in MR. It's a special problem in the heart because you've got every few seconds, and motion causes artifacts in the signal. So you can imagine that speed is critical if you're going to be doing coronary applications. These emotions again. That's not working. Anyway, it's supposed to be beating. The whole idea of Dan's work, because he's a cardiovascular specialist, is to come up with a way of doing a whole heart exam in 5 minutes. And that would consist of a series of just a few breath holds. So you're getting a bulk of information with each time the person holds the breath. And we think about the limits of how long, say, an impaired person or someone who doesn't have very good cardiovascular fitness can hold the breath. They can't hold it for very long. So you've got to be able to get as much information as you can out of each of those breath holds. And remember, too, that the system is going to be different in the next breath hold than it was in the first one. So this presents a lot of challenges, but what he's working toward is an entire heart anatomy exam in 5 minutes where you're learning about the function of the heart, the perfusion, the ability of blood to circulate throughout the cardiac system, the viability of the tissue involved in the heart. And they're working toward that. We're not quite there yet. The other example I want to give you is very different from imaging. And this is actually what Dennis was referring to when he introduced me. In the early 2000s, the institute that I was working at before, the Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, was very interested in developing sensors to detect alcohol use. Things that people could use in treatment settings, say hospital settings or some rehab settings, for example, or remote settings where maybe you're at home, you're under house arrest, or maybe we just need to know for other reasons if you're consuming alcohol or not. There are a lot of reasons to follow that. So we developed a program where we really wanted to develop the best sensors. There just weren't any out there. This wasn't an area where technology had discovered a biomedical need. But what Dennis pointed out was, well, the biosensor is just a gadget. What we really need is a way to manage the data that comes from the gadget. If you think about a sensor that you wear, it's accumulating data all the time. What do you do with it? How do you manage it? How do you cope with it? How do you transmit it? Those are the kind of things we also wanted to deal with at the same time, which made the program a bit more challenging. This particular project had two parts. She was the comms part of the project, and the other part was done in Georgia. I will talk about just the comms part because it has much wider applicability. So, in medical needs right now, telemedicine is a very big thing. And what telemedicine requires, among other things, is the ability to connect a patient who may not be able to come to the clinical center with a physician who's monitoring them in some way. This could be routine health care. This could be following a terrorist attack. This could be following a hurricane where the physicians can't necessarily get to the people who need them. You have a way to distribute sensors that then can be monitored. You can help a lot of people in a very short period of time very cheaply. So the big thing if you're working wirelessly is you have huge power requirements. And that was actually one of the big bugbears for this system, was finding a way to manage power consumption. So they developed a sensor with these requirements in mind, that they had low bandwidth limitations, that there were active and static nodes, and that we knew that we would lose information, so we had to have a system that was responsive enough and adaptive enough so that packet losses could be coped with. And most importantly, had to have a way to preserve power. So this is the general idea. You have your sensor. Whatever you're sensing, we're not going to worry about that, what that is right now. And this is not working. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So the sensor then connects via a cell phone. And using, they thought about cell phone networks, internet, cell phone networks are definitely emerging as the way to go, to transmit wirelessly to a server, which then can be accessed by the physician. So you have monitoring of whatever's going on this end. And the idea was to make this as adaptable and flexible so that you could use it anywhere and in a variety of situations. So, anyway, so say you've got a sensor reading over time. What you need to be able to do is have a sensor that will turn communication off if you don't have anything of interest that needs to be transmitted, but can respond if you have a big change in signal, which is what we see here. And that would be true in the alcohol situation if you have somebody suddenly taking a drink, but there are a lot of other things that can trigger this disruption. Here's an example of telemedicine in the post-9/11 era. Say you had a need to monitor a large number of patients. They also worked on extending the transmission range. This is still rather modest, but it's better than it was when they started. Because of their choice of comms, their able to handle hundreds of patients using the same bandwidth. They make it flexible so that using TDMA so that they can handle a large number of users to varying extents at the same time. And they also built into the system ways of adding more flexibility. So I was talking a minute ago about frequency hopping, which is something that was very critical to their design, so that you could move from node to node as necessary. Say you're in a very noisy environment in terms of phones, and you had to be able to adjust to find a way to transmit the data. That would be very true in a situation where you had a bunch of injured individuals. And you also have the issue of jamming when you've got a noisy environment. So they work very hard to be adaptive under very, very stringent and trying conditions. They used an MDP-based AI controller for managing adaptive control. And as I mentioned before, they used computer vision multiple access for adding additional adaptability to noisy environments. And they also used multi-scale wavelet transform, which gave them additional degrees of flexibility. Most of this I've talked about before. So how does this work for them? In their basic signal, they perform their wavelet transform, so they get wavelet coefficients, and then they packetize those. And the way that they packetize them actually makes a big difference. So you have this compression scheme that allows you to take your receive coefficients and interpolate so that you can figure out, say you lost some data in the transmission, you can interpolate and figure out what you may have lost based on nearest neighbors and reconstruct your signal. This is another representation of what I just said. This is, if we didn't have the wavelet transmission system and we did regular serial transmission, then if we took a bit of fine-grained data, we could reconstruct some, but if we sent just fine-grained data and coarse-grained data separately, if you lose things that way, you can't necessarily reconstruct them. It creates a gap that you can't recover. So we need something that's more flexible than that. This is an example of pulse data, which was kind of their baseline as they were developing the system. So this would be their original signal. And their reconstruction of that signal, here's two different algorithms that try to reconstruct signal. This one using considerably more power and time to do than the bottom one. The point here, though, is that you don't need really good reconstruction of signal for certain things. If you're following pulse rate, probably not so much, but there are other medical applications where you would want to know more precisely how things change over time. Blood pressure, for example, rather than other things where you could actually check every few minutes. And if you lost some or didn't completely reconstruct your signal, it would not be too damaging. This compares the standard serial transmission with the packetized transmission to show that because instead of sending one type of data at a time serially, if they send coarse and fine-grained data together in their packets, it's much easier to reconstruct their signal because you've got all those levels in each packet. You know, it's so vulnerable. Also, it takes into account the fact that not all of the frequencies that are transmitted are going to be useful, so it gives you some discrimination capability as well. This helps to conserve both energy and bandwidth in terms of communication. Keeping in mind that generating the data on the sensor line doesn't take any real energy. This is all in transmitting it to wherever it's going to go, where you have to make all these decisions. make the entire process less labor intensive. Time is money. We want to be able to compare data that were acquired on different instruments at different times. We have a lot of unnecessary reproduction of imaging in the medical community, largely because if you went to Holy Cross and had an MR scan done, and then you went to Shady Grove and had another scan done, and maybe this one was done on a Siemens instrument, this one was done on a GE instrument. Even if they were both done on Siemens instruments, you can't necessarily compare them. There are day-to-day issues and user issues that make it very difficult to compare. So we need better models to enable us to compare data that come from different sources. There's also a big trend these days in combining imaging modalities. There's a big push to combine PET scanning with MR scanning, or MR scanning and CT scanning. These are very different things. They're trying to find a way to do both at the same time so that you save, again, time and money. So being able to compare data from different modalities is a major, major problem. We do not have enough people working on ways of combining those data. We also need a way to make data more portable, even in imaging. It's much bigger in sensor comms, but compression of data and transmission of data is huge. Being able to send data to someone's iPhone so the clinician can get instant information about a patient and be able to visualize in real time and to manipulate 3 dimensions. The data from an MR scanner is starting to happen, but it's still on its infancy. And iPhones really rule the world. So we need better models that relate signal to structure and functional properties. This is true no matter what the organ system is. We need better ways of addressing artifacts. There's large-scale motion in larger parts of the body. We talked about how motion is a huge problem in the heart. You can't stop it, so you've got to be able to cope with it. I didn't mention this, but in parallel imaging, noise that's generated is amplified, and this is due to the algorithms that are used to process the data. We haven't found a good way of minimizing the noise, and it's non-linear, the noise is, so it's problematic. There are artifacts introduced by different instrumentation. There are artifacts introduced by RF coils. We need better correction algorithms for inhomogeneity. This is a focus, but as we move to higher and higher field strengths, the problems increase multifold and multi-levels, and so we need much better ways of dealing with especially multi-coil networks. Now I have transmission here. We were talking about receiver networks, but there are also transmission networks for coils. That's a whole other kind of new frontier, really, where there's just not very much work being done at all. There's another type of MR called diffusion tensor. There's also diffusion spectrum imaging. Those have levels of difficulty. That's very high dimensional data that they generate. It was diffusion spectrum imaging that creates those nerve trackings that I showed you. And just the processing of those data, the management of those data, that's a huge problem. And it's slowing down progress in that area. In the area of sensing, we need more and better multiple user interfaces. As we use sensors in different ways remotely, we try to serve underused or remote areas, say in the mountains. We go to low resource settings in this country and in other countries. We need to be able to transmit data from different users. We have to be able to interface those data. We don't have good ways of doing that. We need more and better ways of transmitting and reconstructing data. I showed you one example, but it's one of very few that we actually fund, and I struggle to find more examples of things like that we're funding. The need is huge, and we just don't have very many people working on those things right now. And another thing to keep in mind with sensing is interoperability. I mentioned Metcalfe's law here because the value of any kind of comms network system is proportional to the square of the number of users. So the more adaptable it is, readily adaptable to different users and different environments, the better it's going to be. We also have a need for systems that are able to tell you right away if they're failing or about to fail. Or running out of power, how do you let the person on the other end know so that they don't start getting bad data or no data? We need better encryption. Anytime you're dealing with health data, you have to worry about personal protection and identity protection. So encryption of data that's transmitted is a huge, huge problem. And then the big bugbear is minimizing energy requirements, because communications takes up so much energy. If we could find better ways of doing that, it would help as we move more and more into telemedicine. There's no denying that the technology is driving how we do medicine, but we're just not nearly where we need to be. So I hope I have made a case to you that we do need mathematical solutions to a number of vexing technological problems. And we do have ways of funding this, even though it's not our strength. I'd be happy to talk to you about that later. There are a lot of ways of doing that. We at NIH right now are struggling with the fact that we are very fortunate to be getting a bolus of money from the stimulus package. We're trying to figure out what to do with that. Any suggestions? I'll leave you with this thought. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And nowhere is that more obvious to me than in the federal government. Thank you.
We have time for some questions and discussion. Take your shot.
I have a question on the parallel imaging. Based on my misunderstanding, perhaps, of what you said. With the parallel imaging for obtaining data, does this affect how the technologies they presently use in data acquisition in the case space, for example, using spiral and the like for getting fast data acquisition? Does one mitigate the other, or the two work hand in hand?
The two work hand in hand right now. MR imaging has moved, or is still in the process of moving from entirely sequential to more and more applications of parallel imaging. It's certainly not in every MR system, but it's found frequently enough now that most scans that are done now are done using parallel imaging in some way. But it's usually basic application of parallel imaging, and so the processing is very, very still in earlier stages. It's still a huge, huge problem.
Huge opportunity.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I guess just follow up the question. I was wondering if you can comment on how mature or how developed the parallel MRI technology is. I mean, is it basically already?
Right now, it's a research problem. What I was trying to allude to is the parallel imaging that exists clinically is very basic. And so what I showed you is not used routinely clinically. This is still very much in development. Manufacturers now, some of them make four coil channel systems. Some make 8, but nobody makes more than that. So these instruments that can handle 128 coil channels are developed specially for these research programs. So this is very, very much in its infancy. And one of the things that's going to keep it there is if we don't have a way to do the processing. Yes?
You also discussed telemedicine.
Yes.
And I'm curious, is there a case for real-time telemedicine? And if there is, are there problems with quality of imagery, particularly given that you use wireless infrastructures?
To answer your first question, the answer is absolutely yes. Real-time telemedicine is a primary goal. And again, these are things that are very much in their infancy, still very much in development. At our institute, we have a network that's dedicated to developing things for what we call the point of care. And that's what I was talking about, where you have places where patients, say diabetic patients, have their glucose monitored, but various remote from any kind of major medical setting. They need to be able to transmit those data in real time in some circumstances to one of those centers, and we don't have ways to do that yet. We need them. Another way in which telemedicine has vital needs is in the military. There, on the battlefield, it's a huge, huge problem, and in fact, that kind of large mass patient setting that I showed you is very much related to those needs. We don't have them yet. Hi.
We're talking about the telemedicine. It seems very key point to transmit the data from one person to another. So talking about the image, you show the very platform, you have to do the lossy compression. The issue is how do you guarantee the diagnostic accuracy? And also, is there any legal issue when you do those information loss based on those images to make the diagnostic?
We're not far enough along to address the potential legal problems. I guess the short answer is we'd like to avoid that by making that transmission as robust as possible. So again, it depends on the information. Some kinds of information really, really are going to be of much greater importance. And so you would want to invest your limited energy resources in transmitting those lossless if you need to. Okay, so you can use lossy compression in some cases, maybe you use lossless in others. So we need that flexibility and discriminatory power to decide, okay, this is a critical time. And so the sensor needs to be able to say, this is a critical time, we are now going to transmit critical data, and we're going to expend more energy to do that. Whereas there are other times when we don't. So it has to be able to recognize those things, see those discontinuities, if you will, in the signal, and respond accordingly. That's something that we need as not something. I mean, a sheet's work is really, really moving in the right direction. That's one example.
So the DICOM standard they define the lossy compression between rate-based in the DICOM imaging standard. So does the NIH have anything impact on that standard?
No, not yet. We're not at a point where that would be an issue yet.
Other questions?
Hi.
So you mentioned mobile phones many times in the presentation. So how many of these technologies are you considering actually integrating into a phone or maybe attached to a phone? Because I just as it might solve a few of the problems, if not all, in terms of energy and transmission. Is that a consideration?
Absolutely. In a sheet's work, they started out with the PDA because that was a reasonable starting place as their intermediary point between the sensor and the database. But it became very clear that the cell phone was a much better way to go. And in fact, that's going to be true for a lot of things. I mentioned iPhones in relationship to MR data. And actually, there are a couple of companies that I know of that are working on doing that. And some of it is real time, some of it is manipulable on the phone. This isn't out in the marketplace yet, but it's coming. I can't imagine telemedicine without cell phones. I mean, that is cell phones. I mean, that is the technology. And if you go to third world countries where you have low resource settings, cell phones are the entire lifeline because they don't have the infrastructure even to have regular comm systems. So everything is going to be dependent on their cell phones. And it's the only way that medicine is going to advance significantly in those situations. It's the only way you can get the technology to them. So don't lose your iPhones. Invest in Apple.
Thanks very much, Karen.